I'm sorry I can't be there with you in lovely Bochum, but we are in the midst of a pandemic. For all the tragedy it has brought and the difficulties in fighting it, we have a discipline of public health, and we have a magical ability to observe in as much detail as we want the work of those public health professionals. We can find their papers, journals, even blog articles in online libraries. We can analyze the software tools that they're using, sit virtually in their symposia. The internet has brought this new and different state in my lifetime, and the internet has certainly brought problems, and I'll touch on those. But first, I want to talk about public health because we can use it as a mirror. It can help us think about what's important. I also want to say that this lecture has been a tremendous opportunity to explore and bring together threads into a small tapestry, and I'm deeply aware that this tapestry is not yet complete. I want to thank Angela for getting me started on it. The context for this and much of my work is focused on how we build more secure systems, and the demands of that work underlie this thinking. Investigation into public health has exposed a lattice work that can usefully inform our security work. That lattice is the knowledge that informs what threats we worry about and which we address in a more concrete way. Today I'm going to talk about four things. The first is the real discipline of public health. That will lead us into a second, a substantial investigation of what a discipline of cyber public health might be, and then third, what cyber public health could do. From there, I'll close with a call to action. So by public health, I mean the science of protecting and improving the health of people and their communities. This work is achieved by promoting healthy lifestyles, researching disease and injury prevention, and detecting, preventing, and responding to infectious diseases, and that's from the CDC. Now, public health work ranges from very abstract research to very concrete practice. And the public health toolkits include surveillance and monitoring systems, and these are supported by standards of practice and reporting, all of which inform advice for both the public and practitioners like doctors. These systems support quantifying the state of the world and enhancing our understanding of emerging problems. And those problems range over communicable and non-communicable diseases, risky behaviors like smoking, and environmental factors such as pollution or asbestos. And while the last few months have been quite difficult for health practitioners and officials, their overall track record of saving, improving, and extending lives is one of the great success stories of the last few centuries. We have public health professionals educated in and advancing the science of public health. We have institutions dedicated to promoting it. Those institutions exist at many scales, local, national, and international. We have institutions defining and gathering statistical measures. Those measures include, most prominently, deaths, but also hospital admissions, and for some diseases, doctor diagnoses. We have guidance for the public. We have systems of coercive power used to require public health measures ranging from washing of hands in restaurants to quarantine and even mandatory treatment. Many of the calls for public health models for cybersecurity have focused on these coercive powers. For example, Mulligan and Schneider's doctrinal approach focuses on producing cybersecurity and managing insecurity. And they say the analogy with public health inspires cybersecurity measures like prevention, containment, and mitigation. They also discuss how the doctrine must include a balance between individual rights and public welfare. The statistical and institutional systems that underlie public health are both deep and broad. Within the US, they include well-known institutions such as the CDC, but also funders such as the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. There are public health departments at major universities, etc., etc. And those who want to move towards a public health model will find this study really rewarding. And I can only give a little taste. Seddenberg and Mulligan go into great depth on these institutions. One taste. In the United States, there's a Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists who are responsible for the way in which we track diseases. The CDC relies on them. Their reporting framework defines not only the criteria for counting something as a disease, also what a report should contain, diagnostic confidence levels, including suspected and probable. They define when something must be reported, and tension over those mandates has come into public view lately. Now, public health interventions range from announcements to quarantines. Effective response is a major subject of research in public health, and each step in the process is studied and honed. One characterization of the process of improving people's health is in Rowe from another study of cybersecurity public health. It's about helping people recognize the threat, assuring people the treatment is safe and effective, making the treatment convenient and attractive, getting the word out, coordinating responses between different organizations, dealing with unpredictable humans, and all of these have analogs that we can think about for cybersecurity. Now, public health is not perfect. There's a widespread perception, for example, that nutrition advice is fast changing, even if the underlying advice, eat less, mostly plants, remains mostly the same. Our understanding advances, and we've moved from cover your mouth when you cough to cough into your elbow. Public health advice isn't perfect. There's a widespread perception that nutrition advice is too fast changing, even if the underlying advice of eat less, mostly plants, remains the same. Our knowledge of health advances, and we've moved from cover your mouth when you cough to cough into your elbow. We'll come back to these. Before we do, I want to acknowledge briefly that these institutions are under tremendous pressure and are trying to respond under uniquely trying circumstances. They're under a siege of distraction, naive criticisms, rapid spread of conspiracy theory. And there are also reasonable questions about the quality of models, decisions about the responses. There are questions about operational failures of the CDC and its leadership. There are attacks on the impartiality of the World Health Organization. Without weighing in on those discussions, I envy public health institutions who we thought would competently lead us through the pandemic. I do not envy their new role of sacrificial lambs for politicians. And while sacrificing a Paschal lamb may have protected the Jews of ancient Egypt from the angel of death, today's public health experts have developed more modern and effective approaches. Let's turn our attention to a discipline of cyber public health. It may be useful to distinguish information or cybersecurity and a newer idea of cyber public health. Briefly, early work in computer security was framed by those who could afford computers. The military and banking institutions who bought early computers saw their security needs formalized in the Bell LaPadula and Biba models. Computer security was a matter of a CIA triad, referring, of course, to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, not the American Intelligence Agency. The CIA, to be assured, were those of the system owner. Applied research work in topics such as the analysis of computer viruses, usable security, or the role of technology in intimate partner violence struggled to find a home in the computer security discipline. Perhaps these could be well served in a frame of cyber public health. So I'm going to start with an initial differentiation between cybersecurity and public health, which I just did, going to talk at length about security engineering practice, and then turn to what public health might do for normal people. Talk about some of the challenges for cyber public health and its limits before coming back to what we might achieve. Now, we have beliefs and intuitions about the cyber components of a healthy lifestyle: updating software automatically, using a strong password, not clicking on suspicious links. Of course, much of that advice is of a suspect quality. We know real people can't inspect a URL, and the problem is made harder by organizations that send crazy complex URLs. Should our advice be to use a password manager or a strong password? This variation shows up in a study by a team at Google. This image is from a blog version of a Usenix paper by Yulia Ion and colleagues. And if we look beyond the obvious disagreement between experts and non-experts, we can take note of something interesting. It's not clear what problem is most important to address. Experts seem to be gravitating to software updates, but is that because exploitable vulnerabilities fixed by updates are the most important problem? Or because they believe it's simpler or lower impact on the person who's struggling to stay secure? If we want to research disease and injury prevention, how do we select the problems we want to tackle? Where do we go for data to prioritize our interventions or to measure their effects? There's two parts to answering this. One part is that we lack data about the things which go wrong. We also lack bounding of the space in which those elements exist. Even within very traditional information security, we lack the statistical and institutional scaffolding of public health, and we lack agreement on what cyber public health might include. Let me illustrate the latter. Perhaps the space of disease and injury prevention is analogous to problems that result from design flaws, exploitable vulnerabilities, default settings, user configurations, and human choices. Let me display that slightly differently. It's the same elements from the right side of the last slide, and we can transform that from an idea into an equation and say that those define a space. We can say that A times flaws and B times vulns and D times config, etc. equals 1. Now, not only do we not have very much data on what the values of A, B, C, or D might be, but more, I'm not really comfortable standing by the terms in the equation. What I know is that we, as reductionist scientists, ought to be able to write such an equation without having to argue about which terms are included. Doing so, like Drake did, can inform how we work. Now, the number 1 is there to indicate that these components make up some whole, say all breaches in 2020. In saying that they equal 1, then some fraction of breaches attributable to flaws and some other fraction is attributable to vulns. But I'm unable to define that whole for either information security or public health. Should it be breaches resulting in the exposure of sensitive information, compromises which might lead to breaches, installation of malware, regardless of if that malware can get commands or exfiltrate data? Also, while 1 is intended to represent the concerns of a discipline, the discipline of computer security may exclude things where computers impact on the health of or well-being of people or their communities. Should it include cyberbullying, addiction? It may not make sense to claim that one incident of cyberbullying is equivalent to one extraction of the OPM database, or that one OPM impacted person is equivalent to one victim of bullying. And so perhaps we should add in other. And here I've added F times other. But in doing so, we lose any meaning for that number 1. Now, a variant of this problem was pointed out by Cormac Hurley and Paul Van Oorschot in their persistence of passwords work. We don't know the relative importance of keyloggers, phishing, online or offline brute force in the compromise of passwords, and that impacts our ability to design effective defenses. So we can extend equation 2 to add authentication as G times authentication, and then break out what the components of authentication might be within some space of either cybersecurity or public health. And in doing this, we can ask what the field of information security or cyber public health seeks to solve. Now, this foray into pretend math may have distracted you from the lack of data collection mechanisms, taxonomies, methodologies, or institutions. That's not my intent. My intent is to say if we don't know what protects or improves people's health, that puts strong limits on the effectiveness of our efforts to improve it. Let's look at security decisions being made as a product is being designed, developed, and deployed, and then the decisions being made in how people use it. The technology we use is comprised of more technology, and engineering decisions are made not only for products delivered to people, but for products delivered to other technologists who combine them into more and more complex packages. There are many places along the delivery spectrum that can be labeled security engineering. I'm focused on building components and systems that can be operated securely, separately, or in combination. The design part of that work is often called threat modeling. That work is intended to prevent weaknesses in the design and architecture of a system. I'll talk about some specific ways that work can be applied in a moment, but before I do so, I want to foreshadow that the message we use are, at best, imprecise. My work in cybersecurity is focused on improving these products and systems at scale. As a consultant, I help organizations focus on how they engineer their products. That work is informed by a long history of delivering product and product improvements, and I'd like to focus for a minute on one product improvement, the story of Autorun. If you're old enough to have used Windows 95, you'll remember needing to manually run software installers. Software companies would print instructions on CDs for starting the installer, and still had to operate expensive support lines to help people install their software. Microsoft introduced a feature called Autorun to address this. When a drive was mounted, if there was a file autorun.inf, it would be executed. Software makers could automatically launch their installers when a CD was inserted. And when a USB drive was attached, code would run. This was great for example, encrypted drive packages. The drive maker could launch a cryptographic program that would prompt for a password, provide the decrypted content of the drive. Microsoft called it a feature. Security experts worried at the time that it was a flaw, and as time passed, malware authors became aware of the opportunity. Malware started to write copies of itself to USB drives. There was a perception that it was a big problem. In 2010, work I was doing allowed me to quantify that problem. The quantification, frankly, wasn't very good, but it was good enough to allow us to push a user-visible change to Windows XP and Vista through Windows Update. Microsoft hates to impose user-visible changes outside of a major release because we worried that changing behavior would lead people to turn off Windows Update and in turning off Windows Update, reduce the resilience of their computer to attack. By the way, I've left Microsoft and can't speak for them. I say we because I still share their concern about turning off automatic update. And those concerns are buttressed by my feeling of being battered by Zoom updates and the usability challenges they carry. But I digress. There are a few lessons from the Autorun story. One is that when we started, we didn't know what led to malware taking control of machines. So not only could we not quantify the frequency that Autorun was on the path, we couldn't compare it well to the rate at which Windows Update was intentionally turned off. The work clearly showed it was old vulnerabilities, so Windows Update mattered, and old vulns in both Microsoft and third-party software that was under attack. And so the state of Windows Update is relevant to the security of the machine in some way. Note, I talked about worry, not about data. Our ability to make public health style changes to reduce danger was limited by both a lack of data and the poor quality of the data. Also, when I was looking at this, going back to this equation, there was no data available that even hinted at answers to defaults or configuration. And the taxonomy I crafted, Broad Street, was focused on how computers are compromised, which, by its nature, excluded phishing and other such attacks. So, Autorun was pretty much being used as designed. There are serious security problems that stem from insecure defaults, which most people will never change. Some of those are set because of a tension between security and usability, perceived or real. There are serious security problems because choices are poorly presented, because people can't do their jobs without taking risky actions like opening PDF documents or LaTeX ones. We sometimes hide those behind warnings which help us blame the end user. People and the context in which they use software are approximately responsible for some fraction of security problems. But I can't tell you how many security problems have resulted from a well-intentioned person enabling an attack at a crucial moment. I also cannot tell you how many have an ill-intentioned but authorized person behind them. Diana Freed and colleagues have done work on intimate partner abuse by a set of attackers who they label interface bound. Some of the attacks involve using features such as Find My Phone directly. Others involve the use of stalkerware, programs which use the APIs of a device as designed in appalling ways. These attacks are clearly deeply meaningful to the victims. And today, we cannot quantify the frequency of attacks by interface-bound attackers relative to those that exploit software vulnerabilities. I do know that we spend dramatically more effort managing those vulnerabilities than the issues used by interface-bound attackers. Misuse or abuse of features is not the only source of security problems. Some security problems result from attackers exploiting errors by programmers. It would be helpful to be able to relate those to other things which damage public health. By simple count of enumerated issues, design flaws are dwarfed by vulnerabilities. But how often is each a problem? There are only 7 coronaviruses that make people sick. Some of these vulnerabilities are failures by the developer using a tool badly. Other times, they come from tools that can't be used well. For example, the sprintf call requires careful use of quotes to avoid interpreting data passed to it as format strings. It's a tool that's nearly impossible to use safely. More broadly, languages that lack type safely are hard to use well. How should we think about code in PHP or C, or code which makes heavy use of a complex cryptographic library? Requiring developers to have perfect syntax adds to their cognitive load. Deferring it to analysis programs adds steps and requires developers to keep more code in mind. All of this plays into the way in which we quantify what's going wrong in security for information security or public health. So some security problems are a result of developers committing sins of omission, failing to recognize that they must authenticate, sanitize, or otherwise apply security knowledge to a situation. We should, of course, aim to reduce our dependency on normal developers knowing about security, recognizing the situations in which they must apply that knowledge, or applying it correctly. Without knowing which errors are common and which require developer knowledge to address, how can we provide appropriate education or training? How can an organization make a decision about the security benefit of replacing a library or even an implementation in unsafe language without public health style data? From there, let's turn our attention to decisions by normal people and the security of the systems that they use. The general public is at the receiving end of a great many decisions by technologists. Most immediately, the computers and the software we use, crafted by a small number of companies whose interests differ from ours. Many of the computers we use no longer look like computers. It's impossible to buy an electric car without a cellular connection to the cloud. The choices that citizens have in selecting technology is limited, and while there's active research in how to inform the public about the security aspects of those choices, it remains that research. Once we, as citizens, have selected technology, we use it day to day and sometimes under the influence of attackers who trick us into doing something that reduces our security. Security experts rarely give advice on the level of wash your hands. We might think that advice like use strong passwords or keep your system patched is at the same level, but first, the advice we as experts give is highly inconsistent, and second, most of it doesn't pass the first step in public health advice, helping people recognize the threat. I'm not going to get into a debate right now about are the threats understandable by normal people, but rather ask, if people don't understand the problem, why would they prioritize your request for their time? People don't exercise for 30 minutes a week. More, normal people are asked to configure software, to make decisions by security warning dialogues, and otherwise act in ways that influence the security state of their software. So, I want to turn to elements of cyber public health that exist. We have some public health-like institutions in the world of cybersecurity. For example, we have certs and sharing centers. And largely these focus on information about vulnerabilities and intrusions. Intrusions are characterized by indicators, IP addresses, hashes, file names. Sometimes they include information about the means of attack. And there's a level of objectivity to such data. The data we get about intrusions is augmented by incident response companies who gather and analyze and release information about the work of various attacker groups. I'm avoiding the word publish because it's common for the work to be restricted in distribution and rare to see it peer-reviewed. So, we have government agencies, and I don't want to critique the work they're doing, but I will note that science, data gathering, and dissemination is not listed in the missions of organizations such as CASA or ANISA. CASA is focused on comprehensive protection, infrastructure resilience, emergency communications, and a risk management center. ANISA is focused on expertise, policy, and capacity. The Centers for Disease Control are focused on health security, putting science into action, helping medical care, fighting disease, and nurturing public health. We have academic research, and I'll note with admiration the work that the Cambridge Center for Cybercrime does in gathering data about cybercrime both in depth and over time. And I'll note that it's data on crime, which is an important subset of a larger problem. I'll also call attention to the work of Fanny Lalonde Levesque and team at the École Polytechnique of Montreal in instrumenting laptops to understand their in-the-field patterns of pathology. That team has been steadfast in their dedication to real-world observation, to overcoming the many complex obstacles to such observation. And there are others, such as the Stanford Internet Observatory and the UCSD Network Telescope. So, Daniel Kahneman reminds us of the important principle that what you see is all there is. And in hearing about information sharing, we often assume that the right information is being gathered and shared. But again, the information is too often about indicators and less often about problems or mechanisms. The information which is shared rarely enables further research or results in new discoveries. We have an interesting analog to the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists, which is VirusTotal, now operated by Google. You can upload things to VirusTotal and it will tell you what a wide set of tools, anti-malware tools, tell you about that sample. In a sense, it's far superior to the Council of Epidemiologists' publication of definitions because you get an answer about your precise sample. For example, in this blog post at SANS, they reference VirusTotal, so we can go and get data about these files. And as you can see, there's a lot of data. And in a sense, it's far inferior because those answers don't align. Clicking on the two malware-retrieved SHA-1 links in the ISC blog post, one reports 36 detections, the other 42. We don't know why the answers don't align, and that makes doing science more difficult. The problem of reaching alignment is complicated by the reality that companies treat their detection algorithms as confidential, because unlike biological viruses, malware authors will test their malware to ensure that it's undetected. So let's go back to this definition. The science of protecting and improving the health of people and their communities. The work is achieved by promoting healthy lifestyles, researching disease and injury prevention, and detecting, preventing, and responding to infectious diseases. These problems, from Autorun through vulnerabilities through usable security, have a common set of properties. From designed features to accidental properties such as vulnerabilities, security engineers face challenges of prioritization and resourcing. The public, as consumers, enterprises, or government, face challenge allocating budget and judging the choices which engineers or software producers have made. The effects of those choices are hard to judge. It's easy to rationalize deprioritization of security. Disciplined statistical work in a public health frame could inform both which problems to address first and which advice to prioritize. It could help us prioritize which treatments to measure, as well as investigations into ensuring treatments are convenient and attractive. Statistics could help us discover which populations are at greater risk and inform the work of civic organizations. Having such statistics be consistent, limiting their bias, would serve everyone, the possible exception of makers of snake oil, but even they could benefit from spending their energy on something more useful. There are some broader questions that we can ask. One question is who's harmed? And there are good technical reasons that we don't always ask who's harmed within information security. It can be hard to answer, and the goals of information security, such as confidentiality or integrity, are often defined as properties of systems and assurance of those properties. And as software eats the world, it seems reasonable to consider if we need to either expand our InfoSec discipline or to create an adjacent one to be a home for questions that we should ask. What are the equivalents of deaths or years of productive lives lost? Is it systems lost to ransomware? Should we care about a system lost to ransomware if it was backed up? Accounts taken over and not recovered? Accounts taken over where intimate data is shared. I include images, but don't limit myself to them. I have friends whose electronic flirtation and love letters were found in the possession of an arrested attacker. Decades later, the feeling of violation remains. Where do funds stolen in scams fit in? What about surveillance and violence against intimate partners? A closely related question is, by what means is cyber health damaged? What should be our equivalents of disease, environmental, and lifestyle issues? And it's worth noting that each addition to public health's remit was hotly contested by those profiting from damaging the health of others. At what rate is authentication subverted? We know from Google that two-factor authentication results in an incredible decrease in account takeover. What we don't know about includes but is not limited to, what about SIM swapping, SIM porting? What are the knock-on effects of Gmail as de facto backup authentication for everything? All of these open questions inhibit my applied work in secure development. We don't study the means of infection. Addressing that lack was a slow and laborious precursor to addressing Autorun-driven infections. And in fact, the public health analogy was top of mind when I named the taxonomy I developed to help us understand Autorun. I named it Broad Street after a famous well. The Broad Street well was literally and figuratively central to the story of the London cholera epidemic of 1854. These issues are important to me both in a broad sense and in a very specific one. My daily work is focused on security engineering, especially threat modeling. Prioritizing that work is difficult because we don't know which issues matter. For example, is it more important to improve the policy language for this system or to improve the authentication scheme? This is a real question that I'm helping a customer with this week. We're forced to rely on expert judgment. We can't compare between prioritization schemes, so we end up evaluating on criteria like acceptability to management on grounds like this is minimally invasive or what a consultant recommends. The consultant knows what other organizations do, and that means the recommendation represents industry standard practice, which is defensible in a court of law, but not in a rationalist or empirical sense. If we don't have data, our prioritization will be driven by religion, noise, loudness of argument, Twitter even. Knowing what sorts of problems lead to health issues could help us plan and prioritize security engineering work. Knowing what sorts of problems are gaining in importance over time, or changes in the threat landscape, could inform when making adjustments to older products are important. This epistemological shortcoming impacts both on traditional cybersecurity and how we threat model, but also impacts the ways in which we do research in cybersecurity or cyber public health. It's not unusual even in top academic conferences, to see a paper motivated by references to analyst firms like Gartner or commercial analyses like those from Verizon. And I don't mean any disrespect, but it's reasonable to ask, is this sufficient or the best we can do? Where's the equivalence of the Council of Epidemiologists? Where are the weekly reports of morbidity and mortality? We can and should ground our research in better signifiers of importance. There are some limits to this metaphor. In no particular order, there's differences between the physical and the cyber world that include the production and mechanisms of harmful agents, the differences about physical space, our tolerance of coercion, and the impact of cyber problems. And let me talk a little bit about each of these. So a first difference is in how harmful agents are produced. The entire world agrees that working to produce more potent pathogens is criminal and insane. And in contrast, more potent malware is often framed as a legitimate weapon of war, a tool of espionage, or stealing from rich foreigners. More potent malware is also part of research into defenses. And empirically, limiting research or production has been hard. Extending the Wassenaar arms control agreements to cover cyber weaponry has run into trouble with legitimate research tools. American guarantees of free speech cover software. So, closely related is how harmful agents operate. Real viruses engage in amazing tricks with their DNA and RNA, including borrowing reproductive machinery from their hosts and combining and recombining it in ways that puts software compilers and linkers to shame. Another difference is that cyberspace lacks physical spaces and governing bodies who control movement from one to the next. So the spread of malware is different. Now, the cybersecurity world, a lot of us have workplaces which overlap with the physical places in which we work. And within an organization, firewalls and other protections create an inside and an outside. And there are risky behaviors and cyber public health messages which are workplace-centric. There's an emerging commercial market for security awareness programs, and the companies in that market are making some pretty strong claims about their comparative advantages, which are delivered to and through specific customers. We might learn some very interesting things about the efficacy of those programs if we had standard measuring sticks rather than ones created by those who create the awareness programs. Physical space and cyberspace are different in our tolerance of coercion. Steven Weber has an important analysis of coercion in cybersecurity. Much of that coercion, or use of state power, has previously been focused on measures like patch response times, device health, or mandatory installation of updates, or security software, or even operating systems such as Red Flag Linux. Those seem like more intrusive uses of coercive power than reporting. Perhaps the outcome orientation of public health could simplify things, especially getting more appropriate surveillance. A last difference is that mandatory reporting is easier to achieve when people are dying. Since before writing The New School, I've been interested in the topic of mandatory reporting of cybersecurity incidents. To very briefly summarize, mandatory reporting is hard in cybersecurity because of lawyers worried about lawsuits. My best overall approach for that in the American context is near-miss reporting, where engaging with questions that are less likely to lead to lawsuits may lead to more data. Other countries with different legal systems might find other answers. So, having gone deep into what a discipline of public health could cover, let's turn our attention to what we could have. Let's return to the definition, the science of protecting and improving the health of people and their communities. The work is achieved by promoting healthy lifestyles, researching disease and injury prevention, and detecting, preventing, and responding to infectious diseases. We can build a discipline of cyber public health which could complement information security like public health complements medicine. We can look for equivalents to diseases, both communicable and not, environment and lifestyle. And in this frame, what matters is not the security of the computer, but the ability of people to live full and healthy lives which are partially in cyberspace. So we can develop a more broadly shared and integrated understanding of the problems people face. We know that the problem of how computers are compromised is understudied. And I see several possible ways to study it. We have the work of Levesque as one roadmap to more data. We have an opportunity to study incidents via an NTSB-like entity or through the various firms engaged in incident response. An NTSB entity ready to investigate the most serious incidents would offer consistency. And there are objections from industry which we have yet to overcome. So an NTSB could start by investigating government incidents. We could offer up a carrot of funding for incident response firms or impose a duty of reporting. And again, we could and should study near misses. Doing these many things would enable a broad move from expert opinion and case studies to cohort studies, randomized double-blind studies, and even meta-analyses. And George Dinesius talked about the importance of this as far back as 2014. The software engineering community has moved in this direction thanks to open source, open code repositories, and other evolutions, and their research is stronger for it. So we can start to construct a mission-focused community which spans from the very theoretical through the very applied. Such a community would need ways of coming together where the work of each is valued and celebrated. It also includes a need for incentives. Frank Stajano has recently commented on how the incentives are stacked against them taking their Pico password work forward to real deployment. We could have data gathering institutions who will focus on both compromise and these more broad problems. We need to do so at a time when trust in government institutions is at a historic low, and tools such as contact tracing and vaccines are controversial. We could create institutions whose job it is to gather and disseminate data about the state of the world, such as the CDC's weekly mortality and morbidity reports. So let me close with a call to action. There's plenty of work for many hands, including academics, software professionals, and technology policy folks. Academics can help define the boundaries and scope that we might address. We would be well served by maps of where more research is needed, especially the problems which are hard to define in today's paradigms. Tackling the problems of cyber public health will be interdisciplinary work, when we have such a discipline. That will entail work to add cyber to those other disciplines, and those other disciplines to cyber public health. There are specific tools like workshops and books that could be helpful. This will also lead to a need for different funding vehicles. Those who work at large enterprises know that justifying cybersecurity investments is hard. We can admit that we lack the data our executives want. It's not like we've pulled the wool over their eyes. Admitting that we have a problem is a first step towards solving it. Those in software and systems development know that building secure software, including threat modeling, is hard. It's made needlessly more difficult by a lack of data on which threats materialize and how that's changing. This data could come from a public health institution. It's also made difficult by nonsense about the fast-changing threat landscape, but that's another talk. Those running systems also run into challenges threat modeling. Their challenge is in knowing which defenses work. Their challenge is in knowing which defenses work effectively, so they may prioritize between the many mandatory controls. This challenge, measuring the effectiveness of defenses, is not limited to formal threat modeling. Our inability as a field to objectively assess our own work or prioritize our requests of the other parts of an organization is the shaky ground on which we conflict with the business. Our inability to assess or prioritize is at the heart of why boards are unable to govern or strategize for cybersecurity. And adding more experts to board is not going to address the foundational issue. Lastly, there's work in the policy realm. In some ways, this is analogous to transition to practice, but more importantly, we need to understand how the public health effects of technological systems interplay with other elements of regulation. After all, there's no security violation of the design as they are used for bullying, stalking, harassment, and other problems. Account takeovers, funds being misrouted, are all systems being used as designed. Security regulation may not be the right vehicle, and there are complex questions. Jurisdictional, sectoral versus horizontal regulation, regulatory complexity, non-tariff trade barriers, the list goes on. We need a discipline of cybersecurity public health. The best way to predict the future is to create it. I've laid out how a public health framing can improve outcomes for people and organizations, and this is one of the higher leverage investments we can make. The problem of the pandemic is not ours to solve. The ways in which technology amplifies disinformation and distrust, and so inhibits our responses to the pandemic, should not be ignored. Those systems, those internet systems which carry that disinformation, are working as intended. Their confidentiality, integrity, and availability are not inhibited. The need for a discipline of cyber public health is not merely a need for our engineering work, but a need for our societies. And as intimidating as it may be, there is no time like now to start. I look forward to working with you on it. Thank you.